Okay, so now let's look at inflation, the other half of the misery index. That term was first used in late 1970s when we had very high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. That's called stagflation, and that's an important definition. We had never used the term before because we had never had high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Currently, the unemployment rate's 4%. We think it's probably higher than that here in February of 2022 because a lot of people still are not back in the workforce after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, our economy was doing so well. But inflation, general rise in price level, it reduces the purchasing power of money. The value of your dollar goes down. Consumer price index is how we measure inflation, and you might hear it also referred to as a market basket. Bureau of Labor Statistics goes out monthly and surveys prices in different industries, and it's called a market basket of goods. See if they're generally rising, falling, staying the same. So to determine inflation rate, we take the difference in CPI from one year to the next and multiply that times 100 to get a price index. I'm sorry about the construction there. I hope that it's going to stop. So we see that we had a really, really high inflation rate in the late 70s, early 80s. We started to really have a lot of inflation, and there were both kinds of inflation. Demand pull and cost push were both present then in the 70s. Currently, we have 7.5% inflation rate, which is very high. And the demand pull, we have that now as well. Too much money chasing too few goods. It is almost always caused by excess spending. Government spending has increased dramatically, deficit spending, and that is causing inflation right now. We have had some supply chain issues, but most of those are passing. They're getting fixed, and services aren't sitting out on a boat anyway, and service prices are going up as well. So it's mostly excess spending. We have had some cost push inflation, input cost, of course, gas prices, energy prices are increasing. There's been more regulation put on the energy sector. That's causing supplies to not be as good as they have been, but also, of course, an increase in demand with winter seeing colder weather and so on. So we're seeing both of those present today. Rule of 70, before the pandemic, we had about 1% inflation. Things were going very well in our economy in early 2020, right before March of 2020 when the pandemic hit. Prices weren't expected to double for 60 or 70 years. Now, rule of 70, 70 divided by 7.5, that's 9 years. In 9 years, prices will double if we don't get inflation under control. It's very important that we do. It's difficult to distinguish sometimes. Demand pull will continue as long as excess spending continues, as long as the government keeps spending more money and deficit spending. We'll continue to have inflation, and that could be tragic because there have been countries that have lost their currency completely because inflation was allowed to continue. Cost push will end in a recession. Hopefully, we aren't going to see that, but it's possible. Sometimes you'll hear core inflation, which is without food and energy costs, but goodness, everybody needs those things. So anyway, let's look at the distributive effects of inflation. Nominal income is unadjusted, or nominal values, nominal GDP is unadjusted for inflation. Real income is nominal income adjusted for inflation. So if we look at the percentage change in real income, we have to look at the percentage change in nominal income and the percentage change in the price level. So who's hurt by inflation? Initially, everybody eventually is hurt by inflation, but initially fixed income receivers, because their real incomes are falling. If you get a fixed amount of income every month, you're not seeing a raise at least the inflation rate, then you're being hurt by inflation more than others. Savers, unless you have your savings in an account that's getting a big interest rate, which is almost impossible now, But it's kind of interesting to look at it when you think about a bank lending money. Banks need to factor in the inflation rate. Currently, interest rates to buy a house, let's say they're 3%, which is about what mortgage rates are. Bank locks that in for 30 years. What if inflation's running faster than that? The bank starts to lose money on those loans, and so if you're a borrower, you're paying back dollars worth less than the ones you borrowed. So that can't continue. Banks have to make money to stay in business. So interest rates will probably start to edge up. They're going to have to squeeze inflation out of our system. Who's unaffected? A COLA, COLA, that is cost of living adjustment, and Social Security recipients have that built in. If inflation is 7.5%, that is what they will get as a raise in their Social Security checks. So they're protected against inflation. Some union members or workers that are able to get contracts with built-in inflation rates, but currently they probably haven't even considered that, because until recently we have had very low inflation, really over the past 20 years or so, or more. So it hasn't been a problem. But I would expect when people start to negotiate their contracts again, they're going to start demanding to get increases at least the inflation rate, if they can. So, but in the long run, everybody is negatively impacted. When we start to lose the value of our dollar, then that's a real problem. So a real interest rate is adjusted for inflation. If we look at the nominal interest rate, that would be what a bank would charge. And then the real interest rate is that nominal rate minus the inflation premium. That gives the real interest rate. Obviously, that has to be positive for a lender to make any money. And we got into that in the early 1980s when we first invented the term, first started using the term stagflation. That's when we saw interest rates really, really get high and increase. Deflation we have not seen since the Great Depression, and we saw prices fall for about 4 years. But the problem in the Great Depression, even though prices were falling, incomes fell faster. So we don't want deflation. Really stable prices would be ideal. There is some view that mild inflation is best for an economy. One view is zero inflation. The Federal Reserve targets a 2%, and if it's 2%, they're not going to worry at all about it. Currently, it's higher than that, and though there is a concern. Cost push inflation will reduce real output, and that's gonna continue as long as energy prices are really high. So we hope that we can get that down. Hyperinflation is really inflation over 100% a year. Germany after World War I had that. They lost the value completely of their currency. Venezuela has experienced this. They eventually just lose their currency, and nobody wants to accept it anymore. And that's tragic for an economy. And some economies have collapsed over that inflation. Certainly Venezuela is a good example, but they've had other issues as well, as they've become almost almost communist country, extremely socialist, and their growth rate is very, very low. Poverty rate is huge. Crime rate is terrible. And a lot of countries, can't get that inflation under control. Nobody wants their currency, so it's a real problem. So anyway, that kind of wraps up inflation, and that's that.